The moment my daughter-in-law looked at me and calmly said I would be better off living alone, something inside me cracked in a way I did not think was possible at 70 years old. I had sold my home, trusted my family, and believed I was building a future surrounded by love. Instead, I found myself standing in a quiet kitchen on Thanksgiving night, holding a warm pie and realizing I no longer belonged in the house my own money had helped build. I walked out without arguing, without shouting, but that single step out the door would change everything I thought I knew about family, trust, and dignity. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I am 70 years old. When people look at me now, they see a quiet woman who runs a small bakery near the harbor in Newport, Oregon. What they cannot see is how many lives a person can live inside one lifetime. The life I have today is not the one I expected to have. The story of how everything changed began long before the night I picked up a warm pie and walked out of my son's house without looking back. For most of my adult life, Newport was the only place I ever imagined living. It is a small coastal town where the ocean never really leaves you alone. Even on calm mornings, the wind carries the smell of salt through the streets. Fishing boats move slowly in and out of the harbor, and gulls cry overhead like they have something important to say. It is not a place where people rush. It is a place where people stay. My husband Thomas and I built our life there together. More than 40 years ago, we opened a small shop called Harbor Light Bakery on a quiet street a few blocks from the waterfront. The building was narrow and a little crooked, but it had large front windows that filled with sunlight every morning. Before sunrise, I would already be inside mixing dough, while Thomas brewed coffee strong enough to wake the entire town. By 7 o'clock, the air inside the bakery smelled like butter, cinnamon, and warm sugar. Regular customers came in almost every morning. Fishermen would stop by before heading out to sea, teachers picked up pastries on their way to school, and families brought their children in for blueberry muffins on Saturdays. It was not a big business, but it was a good one. More important than money, it gave our days purpose. Thomas liked to say that people did not just come in for bread. They came for a moment of warmth before facing the rest of their day. I believed that too. For decades, the bakery shaped the rhythm of our lives. Mornings began in darkness before the ovens were hot, and evenings ended with tired feet and flour on our clothes. But we were proud of what we built together. That small shop carried us through every stage of life, including raising our only son, Michael. Michael grew up running through the bakery after school while I finished the last batches of cookies. When he became older, he left Newport to study engineering and eventually settled in Portland, Oregon. I was proud of him. Every parent hopes their child will find a bigger world than the one they came from. 3 years ago, everything changed. Thomas died suddenly from a heart attack on a cold March morning. One day, he was standing beside me in the kitchen measuring flour. The next day, the house felt impossibly empty. Without him, the bakery became too much for me to manage alone. The early mornings felt heavier, and every corner of the shop reminded me of the life we had shared. Eventually, I sold Harbor Light Bakery to a younger couple who dreamed of running it the way we once had. After that, my days became quieter than I had ever known. I walked along the beach most mornings and watched the gray waves roll toward the shore. Sometimes I baked pies for neighbors, but most evenings I sat alone in the living room with a book I barely read. Michael called once a week from Portland to check on me. His voice was always warm, but our conversations were short. His wife Lydia rarely joined the calls. She was a successful real estate agent and always seemed busy. The house felt larger after the bakery was gone, and Thomas was no longer there to fill the silence. Some nights I would sit in my chair and look at the empty seat across from me where he used to sit. That was when the loneliness began to settle in. At the time, I did not realize how dangerous loneliness could be. If you're still watching and this story already has you wondering what went wrong, comment 1 below so I know you're here with me. Because what seemed like a simple family decision would soon lead to a mistake I never saw coming. Now, let's move on to Chapter 2. Autumn arrives gently in Newport. The air becomes sharper, the ocean wind carries a colder edge, and the sky often turns the soft gray color that locals know so well. On one particular afternoon, I was sitting near the kitchen window watching the tide roll in when I heard a car door slam outside my house. Visitors were rare enough that the sound immediately caught my attention. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw Michael walking up the path toward the front door. For a moment, I simply stood there, surprised and happy all at once. My son had always been busy with work in Portland, so unexpected visits were not common. Behind him walked Lydia, dressed neatly as always, her posture straight and her expression calm. Seeing Michael brought warmth to my chest that I had not felt in weeks. He hugged me the same way he always had, strong and reassuring, like the boy who once ran through my bakery after school. For a while, we sat in the living room catching up about ordinary things. He asked about my health, about whether I was still walking along the beach every morning, and whether the house had needed any repairs. Lydia remained polite but quiet during most of the conversation. From time to time, I noticed her eyes drifting across the room, studying the walls, the windows, the layout of the house. It was not unfriendly, but it felt less like visiting family and more like someone observing a property. Later that evening, the conversation shifted. Michael leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together the way he did when he wanted to say something serious. He began talking about how far Newport was from Portland and how he sometimes worried about me living alone. He mentioned the long winters, the storms that occasionally knocked out power along the coast, and the simple reality that I was no longer a young woman. Lydia joined in then, explaining in a practical voice that Portland offered better hospitals and more services for older residents. Their suggestion followed naturally from those concerns. They thought it might be better if I sold my house and moved to Portland to live with them. Lydia explained that their home could easily be expanded to create a comfortable private space for me. She also reminded me that my grandson Ethan was growing quickly and would love having his grandmother nearby. At first, I did not respond right away. My mind drifted toward the memories woven into every corner of my home. Thomas and I had built our entire life in this town. The bakery, the quiet streets, the view of the ocean from my window. Leaving all of that felt like closing a door on the past. But loneliness has a way of softening even the strongest attachments. Over the next several months, I thought about their proposal more often than I expected. I walked along the shoreline many mornings, watching the waves break against the rocks, while turning the idea over in my mind. Some friends gently suggested I should be careful before giving up my independence, but they also understood how quiet my house had become. Eventually, I agreed to the plan. My house sold faster than I imagined, closing for $310,000. Michael suggested that $250,000 could help renovate their home so I would have a proper place of my own. At the time, it sounded reasonable, even thoughtful. Trusting my son never felt like a risk. In the weeks that followed, I packed the belongings that had filled my home for more than 4 decades. Photographs, old recipe books, and small pieces of our life together went into cardboard boxes one by one. Each item carried a memory of Thomas. On the morning I left Newport, I stood on the porch for a long moment and looked out toward the distant ocean. I told myself I was not leaving home. I believed I was moving closer to family. If you're still watching and starting to feel that something about this move doesn't sit quite right, comment 2 below so I know you're following the story. Because once I stepped into that house, the first small signs of trouble began to appear. Now, let's move on to Chapter 3. The day I arrived in Portland felt strangely heavy, even though the sky was clear and the air carried the dry warmth of early spring. Leaving Newport had already been difficult, but I told myself that moving closer to my son was the right decision. Families were meant to stay connected, especially when life grew quieter with age. Michael met me outside the small moving truck that carried the last pieces of my old life. He greeted me with the same quick, reassuring hug he had given me since he was a boy. For a moment, that familiar gesture made everything feel right again. Their house stood in a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with tall trees and wide sidewalks. The homes looked modern and carefully maintained, each with trimmed lawns and clean driveways. Compared to the weathered charm of Newport, the place felt polished and organized, almost too perfect. Inside, the house was bright and spacious. Large windows allowed sunlight to spread across polished wooden floors. Lydia walked ahead of us as we entered, explaining where the kitchen, living room, and guest areas were located. Her voice was calm and efficient, like someone giving a short tour of a property. Eventually, she led me down a short hallway toward a staircase. "This will be your space," she said as we stepped down to the lower level. The basement had clearly been renovated. Fresh paint covered the walls, and the carpet still held the faint scent of new fabric. The room itself was tidy and carefully arranged with a bed, a small desk, and a narrow closet. Everything looked comfortable enough, but the ceiling felt lower than the rest of the house. The only window sat high on the wall near the ceiling, letting in a thin strip of daylight. Lydia explained that the renovation had created a private area where I could have peace and quiet. I nodded politely and thanked her. At the time, I convinced myself that privacy was a thoughtful gesture, even if the room felt a little removed from the rest of the home. The first few weeks passed in a gentle routine. Ethan returned from school each afternoon full of stories about his classes and friends. I helped him with homework at the dining table and sometimes read beside him while he finished assignments. Those moments reminded me of the years when Michael was young. Michael himself often worked long hours at construction sites around the city. Many evenings he came home tired, but still made time to sit with Ethan before dinner. Lydia spent most of her days handling phone calls, paperwork, and meetings connected to her real estate business. Her schedule seemed busy and carefully planned. At first, I tried to make myself useful. I tidied the kitchen, folded laundry when I saw it waiting in the basket, and occasionally prepared dinner so Lydia would not have to worry about cooking after work. One afternoon, I decided to bake a simple apple pie. Baking had always been my way of bringing warmth into a home. As the pie baked, the familiar scent of butter and cinnamon slowly filled the kitchen. The smell reminded me of Harbor Light Bakery and the life Thomas and I had built together. When Lydia entered the kitchen, she paused for a moment and glanced toward the oven. She explained quietly that strong cooking smells could linger in the house, especially when she had business clients visiting. Her tone remained polite, but the message was clear. I apologized and promised to be more careful. After that day, I began noticing other small boundaries appearing in quiet ways. Lydia preferred that I avoid the living room when she hosted meetings. She liked the kitchen kept spotless during certain hours. None of these requests were unreasonable by themselves. Yet together, they made me feel as if I were learning the rules of someone else's house. Sometimes when Lydia spoke to friends on the phone, I overheard her describing me as someone they were helping take care of. The words were not harsh, but they carried a distance I could not ignore. For the first time since leaving Newport, I felt a small uncertainty settle into my chest. At the time, I believed it was simply part of adjusting to a new life. Looking back now, I realize it was the first crack. If you're still watching and noticing the quiet tension building inside that house, comment 3 below to let me know you're still with me, because the small cracks I tried to ignore were about to reveal something much bigger. Now, let's move on to Chapter 4. By the time a full month had passed in Portland, I had settled into a quiet routine that looked comfortable from the outside. Most mornings I woke before anyone else in the house, just as I had done for decades when Harbor Light Bakery still belonged to Thomas and me. Old habits are difficult to leave behind. I would make coffee, sit at the small kitchen table, and watch the early sunlight move across the backyard. After Ethan left for school and Lydia began her work calls, the house usually grew silent again. During those hours, I tried to keep myself busy. I folded laundry when I saw it waiting in the basket, wiped down the counters, and sometimes walked slowly around the neighborhood to learn the streets. Life appeared peaceful, yet something about the house never felt entirely settled for me. My room in the basement remained clean and comfortable, but it also reminded me that I was living slightly apart from the rest of the household. The narrow window near the ceiling allowed in a thin stripe of daylight, but it never carried the wide ocean light I had known in Newport. At night, I sometimes lay awake remembering the sound of waves outside my old home. One quiet afternoon, while Lydia was out showing properties and Ethan was still at school, I decided to organize some of the paperwork I had brought with me from Newport. The boxes in my room still contained documents related to the sale of my house, along with bank statements and closing records. I sat at the small desk and carefully reviewed the pages. The house in Newport had sold for $310,000, exactly as expected. I had already transferred $250,000 to help expand Michael and Lydia's home, so I would have a comfortable place to live. As I read through the bank records again, I noticed something that gave me pause. The transfer I had authorized was not listed under a construction or renovation account connected to the house. Instead, the money had been moved into an account registered under Lydia's real estate business. At first, I assumed there must be a simple explanation. Lydia worked in property investments, and financial arrangements often moved between different accounts during projects. Still, the discovery left a small question in my mind that would not completely disappear. That evening, when Michael returned from work, I asked him about it in the most casual way I could manage. He listened and then explained that Lydia had temporarily used the money as part of an investment tied to one of her development opportunities. According to him, the funds were still safe and would likely grow once the project succeeded. His voice sounded calm and confident, and I wanted to believe him. After all, this was my son. I had raised him, trusted him, and watched him become the man standing in front of me. The idea that he would allow something harmful to happen to me never crossed my mind. So I nodded and let the matter drop. Over the following weeks, Lydia became slightly more distant, though she remained polite in every conversation. She spoke to me with the careful courtesy people sometimes use with strangers. I responded the only way I knew how. I tried harder to be helpful. I made sure Ethan always had someone waiting for him after school. I kept the kitchen tidy, prepared simple dinners when Lydia worked late, and stayed out of the living room when she hosted business clients. Yet despite all of that effort, a quiet feeling lingered inside me. The house I had helped pay for still did not feel like a place where I truly belonged. Late one night, I sat on the edge of my bed in the basement room, listening to the faint sounds of the house above me settling into silence. I told myself that families sometimes needed time to adjust. I believed patience would fix everything. At that moment, I still thought the problem was small. If you're still watching and wondering whether trust can survive inside a family when money becomes involved, comment 4 below so I know you're here. Because the next moment would arrive on a holiday night that should have brought us closer together. Now, let's move on to Chapter 5. Thanksgiving morning arrived quietly, the way most mornings did in Michael's house. I woke before the rest of the family, just as I had done for most of my adult life. The habit of early mornings had stayed with me long after Harbor Light Bakery closed its doors. The house was still and dim when I walked into the kitchen. Outside, the Portland sky hung low and gray, carrying the soft promise of winter rain. For a moment, I stood by the counter and wondered what Thomas would have said about all of this. Holidays had always been important to him. He believed they were the moments that held families together. Without thinking too much about it, I decided to bake a pumpkin pie. The ingredients were simple enough. Lydia kept a well-stocked kitchen, and before long, the familiar rhythm returned to my hands. I mixed the filling, rolled the crust, and placed the pie into the oven just as the first hints of morning light crept through the windows. Soon the smell of cinnamon, nutmeg, and warm pumpkin filled the kitchen. For a few quiet minutes, the house felt like the life I once knew. Baking had always been my way of bringing warmth into a room, even during difficult times. The scent alone carried memories of long Thanksgiving afternoons in Newport when Thomas would sit at the kitchen table stealing small pieces of crust before dinner. By early afternoon, the house began to fill with people. Lydia had invited a few of her colleagues along with one of the neighbors from down the street. Their voices moved through the living room with polite laughter and conversations about work and upcoming property deals. Michael helped set the table while I arranged dishes of food across the counter. Ethan stayed close to me, asking small questions about the pie cooling beside the window. Dinner itself passed without any obvious tension. Plates moved around the table, glasses were refilled, and conversation shifted between Lydia's real estate projects and Michael's construction work around the city. I listened more than I spoke. At times I felt as though I were sitting slightly outside the circle of conversation, observing rather than belonging. When the meal ended and dessert was finished, the guests slowly gathered their coats and said their goodbyes. Soon the house returned to a quieter state, the kind that always follows a gathering. I carried several dishes into the kitchen and began rinsing them at the sink. The pumpkin pie, now half gone, still rested on the counter. Behind me, I heard Lydia's footsteps. Her voice was calm, almost thoughtful when she spoke. She said that perhaps I might be happier living on my own again. She explained that having another adult in the house had made certain things more complicated than expected. She spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded reasonable, even though the meaning beneath them was unmistakable. For a moment, I did not move. I turned slowly and looked toward Michael, expecting him to respond. I waited for him to say something that would correct the moment, something that would remind Lydia that I was not simply a guest passing through their home. But Michael remained silent. His eyes lowered toward the table, and the room seemed to grow heavier with that silence. In that instant, something inside me shifted. The house I believed I had helped build a future, and suddenly felt unfamiliar. I looked down at the pie on the counter, the one small piece of warmth I had tried to bring into the evening. For the first time since arriving in Portland, I understood that something in my life had quietly broken open. After Lydia spoke those words, the kitchen fell into a silence that felt heavier than anything I had experienced since moving into the house. The sounds of the evening lingered faintly in the background. Plates stacked on the counter, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and the distant footsteps of Ethan moving somewhere upstairs. For a long moment, I simply stood beside the sink. Lydia had already walked away, leaving the sentence behind her as if it were something small and reasonable. She had not raised her voice or spoken with anger. That almost made the moment more difficult to absorb. What stayed with me most was not what she said. It was what Michael did not say. When I turned toward him earlier, I had expected something, anything, that might soften the moment. Perhaps a gentle correction, or even a simple reminder that I was part of the family. Instead, he had lowered his eyes and remained quiet. The silence from my own son settled in my chest like a weight. I finished rinsing the dishes slowly, placing them into the rack beside the sink. The pumpkin pie still rested on the counter where I had set it earlier. The crust had cooled slightly, but the filling remained warm. For a moment, I touched the edge of the pie dish, feeling the faint heat through the glass. That pie carried more than a holiday tradition. It was the same recipe Thomas had loved for decades. I had baked it in Newport nearly every Thanksgiving of our married life. Standing there in that kitchen, I suddenly realized how far away that life now felt. I dried my hands with a towel and stepped quietly into the hallway. The house had grown calm again, the way it always did after guests left. Lydia's voice drifted from the living room where she was speaking on the phone. I had no intention of listening, but certain words carried clearly through the quiet space. She was talking about a property opportunity in California. Something about relocating for a larger development project sometime in the coming year. Then I heard her mention that my situation would need to be arranged later. The words were spoken casually, almost like an administrative detail. In that moment, something inside me settled with a clarity I had not felt in months. I returned to the kitchen and looked once more at the pie resting on the counter. The room felt unfamiliar, even though I had spent weeks trying to make it feel like home. I understood then that no argument would change what had already been decided in Lydia's mind. Perhaps it had even been decided long before I arrived. Strangely, I did not feel angry. I felt calm. I picked up the pie carefully, holding the warm glass dish in both hands. The heat spread through my palms, steady and comforting. When Lydia re-entered the kitchen a few minutes later, I spoke quietly. I told her that perhaps she was right. The words were simple, and they required no further explanation. Michael stood near the dining table, still silent. I walked past them both, carrying the pie as if it were the only thing in the room that still belonged to me. The front door opened easily. Outside, the night air felt cold and sharp against my face. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. For the first time since leaving Newport, I felt something I had almost forgotten: control. I did not yet know where I would go. But I knew one thing clearly: I was not staying. If you're still watching and felt the weight of that moment when I walked out with the pie in my hands, comment 6 below so I know you're still here with me. Because what happened after I left that house would change the rest of my life. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The night air outside Michael's house felt colder than I expected. For a few seconds, I stood on the sidewalk holding the pumpkin pie, unsure where my feet should carry me next. The street was quiet, lined with identical houses and dim porch lights. Cars were parked neatly along the curb, and the world looked perfectly ordinary. Nothing about the neighborhood revealed that my life had just changed. I walked slowly toward the corner, letting the cold air clear my thoughts. My car was still parked where I had left it earlier that afternoon. When I placed the pie carefully on the passenger seat and closed the door, a strange calm settled over me. I did not cry. I simply started the engine. For several minutes, I drove without deciding where I would go. The roads through Portland stretched out under the yellow glow of streetlights, unfamiliar and distant. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside motel just outside the city. The place was quiet and nearly empty. The clerk handed me a key without asking many questions. The room itself was simple: one bed, a small lamp, and a window that looked out toward the highway. I placed the pie on the table and sat down on the edge of the bed. For the first time since leaving the house, the weight of the evening finally reached me. Michael had not tried to stop me. That realization hurt more than Lydia's words. I slept only a few hours that night. When morning arrived, Pale light filtered through the curtains, and the sound of distant traffic drifted into the room. I made a pot of motel coffee that tasted thin and bitter, then sat quietly beside the window thinking about where my life would go next. The answer came to me slowly but clearly. Newport. It was the only place that had ever truly felt like home. By mid-morning, I had packed my small suitcase and returned to the car. The pumpkin pie was still sitting where I had left it. I carried it with me again, almost out of habit. The drive toward the coast took several hours. As the highway left the city behind, the landscape began to change. Tall buildings disappeared, replaced by forests and long stretches of open road. Eventually, the air itself began to smell different. Salt from the ocean drifted through the cracked window. When I finally reached Newport that afternoon, the town looked exactly the way I remembered it. Fishing boats rocked gently in the harbor, and gulls circled above the docks as if they had never noticed my absence. I drove straight to the bakery where my old friend Clara still worked. She had helped Thomas and me many times during the years we ran Harbor Light Bakery, and she greeted me with the kind of quiet concern that only old friends understand. Clara offered me a small room behind the storage area of the shop. It was modest but warm, with a narrow window that faced the harbor. That evening we sat together with 2 cups of tea while I explained what had happened in Portland. Clara listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked a simple question I had not yet allowed myself to consider. She wondered whether I had any legal agreement regarding the $250,000 I had given Michael and Lydia. Until that moment, I had been thinking mostly about the emotional betrayal. Now another reality began to surface. I still did not know exactly what had happened to that money. Later that night, I sat beside the small window in my new room, watching the harbor lights shimmer across the dark water. Walking away had been the hardest step. Now I needed to decide what came next. The first morning I woke in Newport again, the sound of seagulls reached my window before the sun had fully risen. Their sharp calls drifted across the harbor, along with the low rumble of fishing boats preparing to leave the docks. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then I remembered the small room behind Clara's bakery and the long chain of events that had brought me back here. The room itself was simple but comforting. A narrow bed stood against the wall, and a wooden chair sat near the window that overlooked part of the harbor. It was not the home Thomas and I once shared, but the quiet felt familiar in a way Portland never had. I dressed slowly and walked through the back door into Clara's bakery. The scent of bread rising in the ovens greeted me before I even reached the kitchen. For the first time in months, the smell of flour and warm dough filled my lungs. Clara handed me an apron without a word. Soon I found myself arranging trays, wiping counters, and greeting the early customers who came through the door before work. The routine felt strangely natural, like returning to a language I had not spoken in years but still understood perfectly. For several hours, my mind stayed busy enough that I did not think about Portland. But during a quiet moment after the morning rush, the thought returned: $250,000. That was the amount I had transferred to Michael and Lydia after selling my house in Newport. At the time, it had felt like helping my family build something better together. I had never asked for a contract or written terms. Trust had seemed enough. Clara noticed the expression on my face as I stood near the counter staring at the harbor through the window. She asked gently whether I had ever spoken to a lawyer about the situation. The question caught me off guard. Until that moment, my thoughts had focused almost entirely on the emotional betrayal. I had not yet allowed myself to consider what had happened to the money itself. Clara explained that a local attorney in town often helped residents with property matters and financial disputes. She suggested that it might be wise to ask a few questions before assuming there was nothing to be done. That afternoon, I walked to the small office the attorney shared with another practice near the courthouse. The building was older, with tall windows and wooden floors that creaked softly underfoot. The attorney listened carefully as I explained everything from the sale of my home to the transfer of funds and the arrangement I believed existed when I moved to Portland. When he finished reviewing the documents I had brought, his expression grew thoughtful. He explained that the money had been transferred into an account connected to Lydia's real estate business rather than directly into a home renovation account. Without a clear written agreement specifying how the funds would be used, the situation was more complicated than I had expected. However, the attorney also said something else. Because the money had been given with the understanding that it would support my living arrangement in the house, there might still be legal grounds to examine how it had been used. Hearing those words left me quiet for a long moment. I had never imagined sitting in a lawyer's office discussing financial matters involving my own son. When I left the building later that afternoon, the wind from the ocean moved through the harbor streets just as it always had. Fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings, and the sky above Newport stretched wide and open. For the first time since leaving Portland, I felt something stronger than confusion. I felt determination. If you're still watching and wondering whether justice or peace would ever come after everything that happened, comment 8 below, so I know you're still with me. Because the final part of this story reveals how everything eventually came to an end. Now, let's move on to the conclusion. The months that followed my visit to the attorney passed slowly but steadily, like the tide moving in and out of Newport Harbor. Life in the small room behind Clara's bakery settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly familiar. Each morning, I woke before the sun and walked through the back door into the warm kitchen where Clara had already started preparing dough. The smell of flour and yeast filled the air, and for a while I could almost pretend that Harbor Light Bakery had never disappeared from my life. Working again gave my days structure. I arranged trays, wiped counters, and greeted the early customers who stopped by before heading to work or out to sea. Some of them recognized me from years earlier and smiled with quiet surprise when they saw me standing behind the counter. Those small moments reminded me that Newport had not forgotten me. While life in the bakery moved forward, the legal process continued quietly in the background. The attorney contacted Michael and Lydia regarding the transfer of the $250,000. What began as a simple conversation soon became a formal dispute once the financial records were examined. According to the documents, the money had been used as part of a property investment connected to Lydia's business. Because the transfer had been made under the understanding that it would secure my place in their home, the situation created legal complications for their project. After several months of negotiations, the matter reached a resolution. A significant portion of the money was returned to me. The outcome brought relief, but it did not repair the deeper damage left behind. Michael called a few times during those months, usually speaking in careful sentences that never quite reached the heart of the problem between us. I listened politely, but the conversations felt distant. Trust, once broken, does not easily find its way back. Instead of thinking about Portland or what might have been, I began focusing on something else entirely. Spending my mornings in Clara's bakery had reminded me how much purpose I once found in that work. The idea came quietly at first. What if I opened a small bakery again? Not to replace Harbor Light Bakery, because that life belonged to another chapter. This would be something new, something built from the lessons of everything that had happened. With part of the money I recovered, I rented a small space near the harbor. I named the shop Second Tide Bakery. The name felt right. The ocean had always taught me that tides return, even after the water pulls away from the shore. On the morning the bakery opened, I stood behind the counter as the smell of fresh bread filled the room. Outside, the harbor wind moved softly through the streets of Newport. For the first time in a very long while, I felt that I had come home. Some mornings in Newport begin so quietly that it feels as if the whole town is still half asleep. The sky turns pale over the harbor, and the first fishing boats slide slowly across the water while gulls circle overhead. Those are my favorite moments of the day. By the time the sun begins touching the windows of Second Tide Bakery, the ovens are already warm and the scent of fresh bread fills the room. I move through the kitchen with the same familiar motions that once shaped my life years ago. Flour on the counter, dough rising in metal bowls, and trays lined neatly beside the oven. Customers arrive in small groups, some of them curious about the new bakery, others remembering me from Harbor Light Bakery long ago. A few people tell me they are glad to see me baking again. Their kindness reminds me that life sometimes offers another beginning when we least expect it. Between customers, I occasionally step near the front window and look toward the harbor. The water never stays still for long. The tide moves out, then slowly returns again, steady and patient. That is where the name of the bakery came from. Second Tide Bakery. The name carries a quiet meaning that only I fully understand. Not long ago, my life seemed to be drifting somewhere I could no longer control. I had left Newport believing that living with my son would bring comfort during the quiet years ahead. Instead, it taught me a lesson I had never expected to learn so late in life. Loneliness can make even a careful person forget their own strength. When I think back to the night I walked out of Michael's house holding that pumpkin pie, I remember how uncertain the future felt. At the time, it seemed like the end of something important. Now I see it differently. That moment was not an ending. It was the beginning of finding my way back to myself. Michael has called a few times since everything happened. Our conversations remain polite but cautious. I do not know what our relationship will become in the years ahead, and perhaps that is something time will decide. What I do know is this: growing older does not mean giving away your dignity. Independence is not something measured by age, but by the courage to protect your own life when circumstances change. Each morning when I unlock the door of the bakery, the harbor wind moves through the street and the smell of bread drifts outside. Another ordinary day begins, and for the first time in many years, that is more than enough. Sometimes life quietly leads us down roads we never expected to walk. The moments that feel like endings often become the very places where strength is rediscovered. Loss, disappointment, and broken trust can leave deep marks on the heart, yet they also reveal something powerful within us, the ability to begin again. Like the ocean's tide, life moves in cycles. It pulls away, leaving us standing on uncertain ground, but in time it returns with new possibilities. What matters most is not the setback itself, but the courage to rise with dignity and continue forward with wisdom. Every experience carries a lesson about self-respect, resilience, and the quiet strength that grows through hardship. Thank you for listening to this story. If it resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how you would have handled such a moment. And if you enjoy meaningful stories like this, consider following and subscribing so you never miss the next one.